A próxima pergunta diz respeito a grandes agências de right enforcement. Imagino que exista economias de escala para as agências crescerem. E como então impedir que essa agência de right enforcement, a mais popular e poderosa, não acabe se tornando um Estado, não tome o poder à força e submeta a população aos seus desejos?
I regret that, unlike my son, I have no duckies to give away. But that's a very good and important question. And as economists know, there are both economies and diseconomies of scale. That a situation where one very large firm can produce more cheaply than multiple small firms is uncommon but occasionally exists. And in my view, one of the most important questions about whether the institutions I describe would be stable is how far the economies of scale go in this industry. If it turns out that one firm providing protection to a third of the population of the United States can do a better job than 5 firms providing smaller numbers, you will then end up with a market with only a few large firms in it. And those few large firms may well decide that robbery is more profitable than protection, merge and become a government, and reestablish taxation. If you end up with an equilibrium in which there are 150 or 500 or 1,000 firms, which is many fewer than the number of farmers we have, more than the number of automobile companies, somewhere between, then if 1 or 2 or 3 firms decide to start robbing their customers by being governments, the customers will call in other firms to protect them. So that, I think, is an important question. There's a second question linked to it, which the question that was asked also hints at. And that's to observe that the rights enforcement agencies are really producing 2 quite different products. One of them is the product of enforcing the rights of their customers. The other is the product of threatening other agencies in order to get good terms on their mutual contracts. Because everybody knows that in the ultimate breakdown, if we can't reach agreement, we start shooting each other. And if I have more guns, that may make you more willing to reach agreement. This is important because the application of military force does have large economies of scale. So if it turns out that a large part of what the firms are producing is the ability to threaten each other and only a small part is the real service, then you'll have large firms. On the other hand, I think if you look at similar conflicts, at situations where you've got sort of an implicit threat game underlying agreements, which describes, for example, all of international policy. All right, in all of international policy, why do governments not do bad things to other governments? Because somebody will shoot back if they do. Nonetheless, if you look at international history, you do not observe that every time a country buys a new battleship, the border moves by half a mile. It looks as though there's enormous inertia in these threat games, so that once you've reached some kind of an agreement on the mutual terms, it takes a big imbalance before I can say, I don't like that anymore, I'm tearing up the agreement, I want a better one. That at least is the evidence I think you see from the case of international activities. So my guess is that if you could once get the system I'm describing established, which is not an easy problem, that once it's going, if a firm says to all the firms it's bargaining with, I've just hired some soldiers, I want to renegotiate all our contracts. The other firms will say, we're sorry, we don't deal with people like that. If you want to fight a war with 100 other firms, feel free, but reasonable people don't go around pointing guns at each other unless they have a good reason to. So my guess is that if you can get it established, most of what matters for an agency is how well it can protect its customers. If that's the case, there's no obvious reason to have big economies of scale, and if that's the case, we may have a successful arrangement. But I certainly don't want to claim that under all imaginable circumstances what I'm describing would work, because I'm sure there are some circumstances in which, for any of several reasons, the anarcho-capitalism I'm describing will break down and won't function. Just as we know that there are some circumstances in which governments behave very, very badly and create a great deal of difficulty. There's an academic who has a web page devoted to estimating how many of their own citizens governments kill. And I think his current estimate for the 20th century is about 200 million. That's adding up all what he calls democide, which is not war. It's governments killing their own citizens for one reason or another. And some of that was the colonial regimes in Africa early in the 20th century, the Belgian Congo being a famous example. Some of that was Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot. He has a sort of a long list. But my point is that there are no human institutions known that are safe. There is no way of organizing human society that has no risks. And the standard conventional way of doing it with governments sometimes works tolerably. All of us are still alive. We're not starving to death. No one's killed us. Doesn't seem to work very well. And it sometimes works catastrophically badly. And I could imagine ways in which what I'm describing would fail. My claim is only that there are ways in which it could work, and that if it did work, it would provide a more attractive outcome than the systems we know. That's as strong a claim as I'm willing to make. Thank you.
Temos uma pergunta lá atrás da plateia.
Professor Friedman, thank you very much for coming here to Brazil. My name is José Antonio Zibert, and I am the head of the legal department at CADE, that is the Brazilian Antitrust Agency. And because of that, I would have a lot of questions to make tonight to you. But one that I would like to focus is based in your new book and the creation of cyberspace. How do you see these new facts related to the creation of this new cyberspace related to United States Constitution and the First Amendment? How do you think that free expression will change, our perspective will change with the creation of this new...
One of the attractive features of what I refer to as a world of strong privacy, the kind of online world where you can control, where you can say things and people can't prove who said them, but you can still have a reputation, is that it gives you a form of freedom of speech that does not depend on the Supreme Court. Because after all, the U.S. Supreme Court only has power in the U.S. It does no good elsewhere. And the Supreme Court sometimes changes its opinions. So I would rather rely on the laws of mathematics, which are what encryption depends on, than on the laws of the Supreme Court. If you're interested in my more general views on law, the book before Future Imperfect was called Law's Order, the nonfiction. I also published a novel in between. That you can read on my webpage for free, as you can read Future Imperfect. I should say I'm not actually in favor of enforcing copyright law. That is, I can see why other people would be. But my own view is that since I am writing books not mainly as a source of income, but mainly as a way of spreading ideas, I prefer to have them readily available online for people to read. And so whenever I can, I do that with my books. And one solution to the problem of being unable to enforce copyright online is that instead of making your living by writing books and getting royalties for the books, you make your living by writing books, the books make you famous, and nice people then invite you to come to Brazil and pay you for giving a talk there. And that's what is a tie-in solution to the problem of copyright. But anyway, the general issue of law is the subject of Law's Order, and it's not a particularly libertarian book, I don't think, but I think it does reveal that designing legal systems is a non-trivial problem. That there really are a lot of complicated issues that don't occur to sort of people who are thinking of it in political ideology and not in terms of potential hard legal problems.
David, o senhor estudou o caso histórico da Islândia. Como o Estado surgiu lá? Vou repetir. O senhor estudou o caso histórico da Islândia. como o Estado surgiu lá? Por que o sistema privado de leis acabou?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And the answer, it's not one where I know the answer. I have conjectures. To begin with, Iceland was never an anarcho-capitalist society. Various people online claim that I claimed it was. But if you read my article on the subject, which is on my webpage, my claim is not that it was anarcho-capitalist, but that law enforcement was private. And which is a part, but not complete. Iceland had a single system of courts. It had a legislature to make law, but the enforcement of that law was entirely private. And it therefore gives us information about one piece of the anarcho-capitalist puzzle, as it were. But the one possible answer to the question, and I have several possible answers to why it finally broke down, but one answer goes back to our discussion of economies of scale. Because in the original Icelandic system, you had something which I've sometimes called franchise feudalism, in the sense that any Icelander had to plug into the legal system through what they called a gothi. But there were about 39 different gothi, and you could choose anyone who would have you. So it was a competitive system. And one of the things that happens in the final period when the system is breaking down is that you're getting large coalitions. So that in effect, rather than being able to play off one gothi against another, the best you can do is to play off one coalition against another one somewhere else. And that's the period when you start getting relatively serious violence among them, in part, I think, because in the first 2 centuries, when people were fighting, it was basically over legal disputes. You have wronged me, you haven't given me the right compensation, so I'll go fight you. And in the last 50 years or so, I think they're partly fighting in the assumption the system is going to break down, and each of them wants to make sure he's the ruler when it's over. So it's switching from a private enforcement feud conflict to something more like a civil war at the end. But there are a number of possible theories about why that happened, and I don't want to claim that I really know. What I do know is that the Icelandic system lasted for about a third of a millennium, about 330 years. It finally broke down during the last 50 years of that period, and the available figures suggest that although the level of violence was high by their standards, it was low by ours. That in the period of breakdown, it looks as though the death rate per capita was probably vaguely similar to the U.S. highway death rate. Probably below the Brazilian murder rate at the moment, though I don't have statistics for that. Now, we can't be sure because we don't have good data, but that's what I think it suggests. And that if you compare it, the one way I sometimes put it is that I think that in 3 weeks of the year 1066, 3 different countries, England, Normandy, and Norway, lost a larger fraction of their population to violent conflict than Iceland did in its last 50 years of violence. So anyway, but it did break down, and it may have been because it became a more concentrated system, but I'm not sure.